Good evening. Welcome once again to Gospelspeak, live streaming from the Rose Drive Library in Morgan, Utah, this evening in December. And we had a little bit of snow this morning, so it looks like winter is soon upon us here in northern Utah. We're here now at session 104, as we can see on the board here, and we'll be talking about the martyrdom. When we talk about that, it's in reference to what occurred in Carthage jail on the 27th of June in 1844 in relation to the prophet Joseph Smith and his brother Hyrum, who was the patriarch at the time. So what I thought, rather than go into a lot of gory details about what happened during that event, I wanted to kind of talk about some of the events and things that led up to the actual incarceration of Joseph and Hyrum in Carthage, and then the eventual assassination of the two brothers while they were there in that prison. So Sean, if we can go to the slides. Okay, I don't have PowerPoint yet.
Why are there two screens?
What's that?
Robert wants to know why there's two screens.
There's two what?
There's two screens. Camera does look a little weird.
I'm not sure.
Alright, something happened with the camera.
Hold on a second. Okay, here we go.
Yeah,
Well, go over to PowerPoint and I'll get started
Yeah.
with it.
well,
Yeah, I can see it here, Sean. Okay, so I wanted to go back and just revisit some of the history as far as the migration of the saints and the movement from its beginnings in 1830, since the organization of the church. When we talked last about the history and where we are in the location, we left off in Far West. And this is where we talked about several events that led up to what's known as the extermination order from Governor Boggs of Missouri. And so during the winter of 1838 to 1839, the main body of the church migrated across Missouri from the area in Far West and some of those surrounding communities over to this little town known as Quincy on the Mississippi River there in Illinois. And as it turned out, they found some acceptance and some friendly people there in Quincy that brought them in and helped them along the way. And during that time, predominantly for most of that, Joseph was incarcerated in Liberty Jail. And he was allowed to escape in April of 1839. When he came then over to that area, okay, I'm not on PowerPoint yet. When he came over to that area then, he was able to find a location. It was called Commerce at the time. But as the saints began to move there and to develop that, then the name of the city, Nauvoo, meaning the city beautiful. And so this, for the next 4 or 5 years, was the main assembling point of the saints there in that area. And by the time of around 1844, there were about 12,000 members of the church that had collected there. Nauvoo was the largest city in the state of Illinois at the time. Very, very prosperous, beautiful city. The temple was under construction. And however, the adversary, of course, knowing that he's doing everything he can to prevent this work from occurring, then brought about more external strife, as well as a significant amount of dissension within the church. And by many accounts, we could say that internal dissension and the apostates that turned against the prophet were a significant part of what led up to the martyrdom. And that martyrdom now occurred in the area of Carthage. That's where Joseph and Hyrum eventually then went from Nauvoo down to Carthage, and we'll talk some details about that. And while they were there in that prison, then the assassination occurred. So this is a location, just to kind of get a quick idea again, from Far West over to Quincy, then just a few months later up into Commerce, which became Nauvoo, and then after 4.5, 5 years, then the event that occurred down in Carthage. So we talked quite a bit about Joseph Smith. I wanted to say a few words about his brother Hyrum, the patriarch. And within the church structure, within the organization back then, it was, and for many years up into the 1900s, up to the 20th century, it was the practice in the church to have a leading patriarch or the patriarch of the church. Now Hyrum, by blood lineage, by his right, and he was set apart to this position by his father, Joseph Smith Sr., was known as the patriarch of the church. So some of the things that we know about Hyrum, based on the scripture, of course, he was the older brother of the prophet Joseph Smith, about 6 years his senior. Very, very loyal and very, very dedicated to the prophet Joseph Smith. In section 124, the statement by the Lord is he was declared by the Lord to have integrity of heart. So he was a very, very honest man. Was not prone to any deception. He was very upright, and as the Lord said, had great integrity. He was designated as patriarch, now meaning the leading patriarch, to the church on the 19th of January in 1841. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints today, there are many patriarchs, ordained patriarchs. In fact, my father, Fred Mazer Crandall, was an ordained patriarch. And they are assigned to the individual stakes of Zion to act as a patriarch and give patriarchal blessings. But here now, at this particular time, Hyrum was the patriarch to the church. We also know, and we've talked about this a little bit before, that due to the dissension of Oliver Cowdery and his eventual separation from the church and excommunication, the blessings and priesthood of Oliver Cowdery were then bestowed upon Hyrum. And that occurred as well on the 19th of January in 1841 in a council and revelation there that occurred in Nauvoo. We also want to indicate, we'll come back and talk about this a little bit more, because the blessings of Oliver were put upon Hyrum, that now established Hyrum, and this was sanctioned by Joseph, and the Quorum of the 12, particularly Brigham Young, understood this as well. That Hyrum now, because he received the blessing that originally was on Oliver, so Oliver could not, of course, continue on in that blessing because he had apostatized and left the church and was excommunicated. So Hyrum now became second in seniority. So when we read in section 20 of the Doctrine of Covenants, where the Lord indicates that Oliver Cowdery was an apostle and the second elder of the church, meaning second only to Joseph, all those blessings, and we'll talk a little more in detail towards the end of the session tonight, all of those blessings were bestowed upon Oliver. In addition, bestowed upon Hyrum. In addition, Hyrum was also set apart and ordained as the assistant president of the church, which meant that he had precedence in the presidency of the church above the counselors, such as Sidney Rigdon and William Law. So he then was second in seniority. He, in fact, was in line for succession, and there are other indications that there are certain individuals recognize this, that Hyrum was in line of succession next to Joseph if Joseph were to pass away. Hyrum was always remained faithful to Joseph and stood, as we will see in just a moment, as the second witness to the restoration after those blessings had been removed from Oliver Cowdery. So I wanted to mention that because we talk a lot about Joseph as the prophet, but it's just as important to recognize and understand that Hyrum, as the patriarch, was in this leading position of the church. We don't often talk a lot about that in church history or in our gospel doctrine classes, but just wanted to bring that out so that we understood where Hyrum stood. I next want to talk about this individual, William Law. So William Law now was a second counselor in the first presidency from January of 1841 through April of 1844. So in this council that occurred in January of 1841, there were many designations, many indications provided as far as leadership. Hyrum as the patriarch, Hyrum then receiving the blessings of Oliver Cowdery, that Hyrum would act in concert with Joseph in the leadership of the church. It was also indicated during that conference there in that meeting that Brigham Young then was the president of the Quorum of the 12. I want to understand and recognize that just based on the practice back at that time, the counselors in the first presidency predominantly were not necessarily ordained apostles. And when we talk about seniority in the apostleship, seniority in the quorum, that these individuals such as Sidney Rigdon, neither Sidney Rigdon nor Frederick G. Williams nor William Law that we see here, none of these were ordained apostles. So none of them had any association with that quorum in terms of seniority. So William Law, good man obviously to start, was set apart as the second counselor in the first presidency. However, sometime around 1844, early 1844, he had committed adultery with a young lady that was staying in the house there with him. He confessed to that, And because of the fact that it was known and recognized that he had committed adultery, that he was excommunicated in April of 1844. However, William was not too pleased about that, so along with his brother Wilson, he became, and the two of them became bitter enemies to the prophet. Now, at this time, again, I see the hand of Lucifer. I see the hand of Satan doing everything he can to destroy the work, to stop the progress of the church. Of course, we recognize, where we've read and studied before in the Doctrine of Covenants, where we are told that the wisdom of God is greater than the cunning of the devil. So in spite of what Satan might do, anything that he could do to stop the work and to halt the work, he was always thwarted in those attempts. Thomas, question?
Robert wants to know when the first General Conference was.
The first General Conference actually was on 6th of April in 1830 when the church was organized. That was considered as the first General Conference. Now, today in the church we have a conference every 6 months. We have the annual and the semi-annual. Annual in April, semi-annual in October. That did not necessarily come into vogue or into play at that particular time, because conferences were held basically many by revelation and as directed by the Lord, but there was no set order as we have today in the church. So again, dissenters going on. William Law, Wilson Law, along with other dissenters, the two Higbee brothers and the two Foster brothers, and many others that were dissenters, they now, because they were disaffected and wanted to just cause contention and stir things up, they established a newspaper which they called the Nauvoo Expositor. And there was only one edition of the Nauvoo Expositor that was ever printed, that ever went out. The editor, in fact, they hired an individual by the name of Thomas Sharp, who was an editor for a different newspaper in a town close by the name of Warsaw, Illinois, and he was against the church. He was anti-Joseph, anti-everything that the church was advocating and doing. And so these brothers now, along with the other dissenters, they decided they would establish this newspaper called the Nauvoo Expositor, and the premise being, we are now going to tell you the true story about the Mormon church. We're going to tell you the true story about Joseph Smith. So much of what was in that first edition was inflammatory, a lot of defamation that was going on. They basically, again, they were bitter. Most of these had come from leadership positions in the church. They became disaffected. So the Nauvoo Expositor was there just to incite discontent among the saints and in the city of Nauvoo. So because of that, then, the City Council of Nauvoo convened a session on the 10th of June in 1844. And I just had a discussion with Sean here earlier, since he's a lawyer. I said, I want to make sure that I'm correct on this. But the City Council now in Nauvoo ordered the destruction of the papers and the press, because it was a nuisance for the city and for that location. Not only would it cause some discontent and questions and consternation within the city of Nauvoo, which of course was largely all members of the church, but also, as this was now going to the surrounding areas, it would now propagate falsehoods about the church and about Joseph and the organization of what was going on. So the city council then ordered that as a nuisance that needed to be basically cease and desist printing this. And a lot of times people will come out now today or back then and say, well, wait a minute, that's against the law. The First Amendment is freedom of the press. That allows me to say whatever I want and print whatever I want. We know today that is obviously true, because you can read all kinds of stuff that's out there, and it's often difficult to determine, is it true or not true? Is it true or just some fabrication? In any case, at the time of 1844 in the state of Illinois and predominantly throughout the United States, that First Amendment initially in the Bill of Rights was only designed to limit the powers of the federal government. So the individual states were not obligated to follow that practice if they chose not to. So in the state of Illinois, it was absolutely legal at the time to issue cease and desist, to take pamphlets and burn them and whatever, and to direct that particular establishment to stop what they were doing, publishing falsehoods. So the city council issued an order and got a little bit, the people that went strong advocates of the prophet Joseph Smith maybe got a little carried away. So not only did they destroy the pamphlets and the paper and whatever, but they took the press and threw it out in the street and burned it and basically destroyed it. Well, again, there's a lot of debate as to whether that was actually legal. It's kind of borderline. They may have gone a little bit beyond the mark in what they were instructed to do. Nonetheless, the press was destroyed. That then led to a lot of negative discussion, negative talk, and a lot of things that were going on there, particularly in the city of Warsaw and surrounding areas, that now I believe that the destruction of the Nauvoo expositor, that incident in fact became the primary catalyst for the incarceration of Joseph and Hyrum in Carthage. Now realize at that time, again, from a political perspective, we're looking at the situation there in Illinois. Those in Nauvoo and the smaller towns around, they are seeing this great assemblage of the members, the adherents to this new faith, and their belief in Joseph Smith as a prophet. In their mind, they were looking at that. This now is becoming a significant block politically. If those 12,000 or so plus saints all voted the same, that could absolutely influence any election that was going on in the county or the state of Illinois. So I would expect, and again, I don't want to speculate too much this evening about different motivations, but in my mind, that certainly was a concern for the other residents there in Illinois in that area. Particularly the governor probably had some concerns as well. Speaking of the governor now, as a result of what was going on, and Thomas Sharp now, who had been asked to edit the one edition of the Nauvoo Expositor, and then the entire establishment was shut down. As I mentioned, all the pamphlets burned and the press destroyed. Went back to Warsaw and said, wow, this is absolutely illegal, absolutely against the law. How in the world can people do this? So they now sent a message up to Thomas Ford and said, well, there's this great illegal movement, this great insurrection that's occurring down in Nauvoo with these Mormon people, and they're ready to go to war. And so Thomas Ford is the governor of Illinois, and he was governor there, as we see, in the 1840s. As the governor now, he came down to Carthage along and assembled militia, most notably a group of about 200 or so militia known as the Carthage Greys. So now what we're seeing is a situation that's being repeated of what the saints just had experienced in Missouri under Governor Boggs and his extermination order. So now we're seeing again, I'm not going to speculate other than to say that certainly Lucifer was at the core of all this that was going on. But I did now just put a copy here of a statement that Thomas Sharp put into the Warsaw Signal 3 days after the expositor was destroyed. And just, again, let's read through some of this and think about what he's saying. How does this make sense when the saints had just been expelled from Missouri? Lawless acts that occurred. In fact, in the early 1830s, when the saints were initially settling down in Jackson County, they had established a press to print the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, sanctioned by then Lieutenant Governor Lilburn Boggs, they determined, well, that's a nuisance. So what did they do? They went in, they destroyed that press. They got every copy they could of the book, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Commandments, and destroyed that, burned that. So they did exactly the same thing. But as far as they were concerned, they were well within their rights, within the laws of the state of Missouri. And so certainly the members in Nauvoo at the time said, well, this has happened in Missouri, and so we have the same rights that Missouri had. And so again, they went ahead with that destruction of the press. Well, here now, Thomas Sharp prints the following, and I'll read some of the statements here. We view the recent ordinance of the city of Nauvoo and the proceedings thereunder as an outrage of an alarming character. So again, as I talked with Sean, at most, the destruction of the press, they could have brought a civil lawsuit, saying, well, these crazy guys came in, they destroyed my press, and they need to reimburse me for the cost of the press. Well, as we'll see here in just a moment as we continue reading, that this went for those in the area that were not members of the church went far beyond a civil case. Reading further what Thomas Sharp wrote, and being under color of law as calculated to subvert and destroy in the minds of the community all reliance on the law. So here he's claiming exactly the same sort of thing that happened against the saints in Missouri. The time has now arrived when the law has ceased to be a protection to our lives and property. So again, he's talking about a law which did not even apply. But again, he's writing things just to be inflammatory. And most people read something in the newspaper and they say, wow, hey, that must be true. The time has now arrived when the law has ceased to be a protection to our lives and property. The public threat made in the council of the city, a public threat now. So we're kind of seeing how these things work. It's blowing out of proportion. Is sufficient in connection with the recent outrage to command the efforts, the services of every good citizen to put an immediate stop to the career of the mad prophet and his demoniac coadjutors. So here Thomas Sharp is, wow, this is our call to arms, our rise to liberty. We need to put a stop to the mad prophet and his demoniac conspirators. We must not only defend ourselves from danger, but we must resolutely carry the war into the enemy's camp. So now he's advocating an attack on Nauvoo. We hold ourselves at all times in readiness to cooperate with our fellow citizens in this state, meaning Illinois, and in Missouri, and in Iowa. And then pay attention to utterly exterminate the wicked and abominable Mormon leaders, the authors of our troubles. So, I read that and said, well, wow, this is real. He's really getting carried away here with what's going on. And so, as a consequence of all that, you can just imagine all the excitement that was occurring here within this week or so, this week to 10 days, this 2-week period of time that was going on. So Joseph now is becoming aware of all this situation that's occurring. And he's trying to decide what should we do. We can so at the time within Nauvoo, they had a military organization known as the Nauvoo Legion, which by all intents and purposes was perhaps the strongest military body in the state of Illinois. And so Governor Ford's here, and all these people in Carthage and Warsaw and surrounding areas thinking, well, if we attack Nauvoo, they have this magnificent militia and people are going to die. We're going to have this great war that's going on. Well, certainly Joseph did not want that. He's writing letters to Governor Ford. Governor Ford, again, I can't say what his particular mindset was against the members of the church, against the saints. My impression is that he was not pro for Joseph or an advocate of the saints, and he probably was under the influence of many of these apostates. William Law, in fact, again, after that occurred, then was in communication with Governor Ford and telling him certain things, and it appears that Governor Ford was listening more to the apostate side rather than to Joseph and the others. So, just a couple of weeks after all this occurred, then Joseph is meeting with some counselors and some leaders in the church there in Nauvoo. The majority of the Quorum of the 12, I think 10 of the 12, majority of the Quorum of the 12 had been sent off on missions. So the Quorum of the 12 was not there at the time. Just notably, John Taylor was there. So I'm reading here now from A Comprehensive History of the Church by Brigham H. Roberts. On hasty consultation with his brother Hyrum and others after the return of the latter from their conference with Governor Ford, it was decided that President Smith or Joseph should proceed to Washington, lay the situation before President Tyler. He informed Governor Ford of his intention in his letter of the 22nd. That plan, however, at a subsequent council was abandoned. Joseph received an inspiration to go to the West, and all would be well. He said to the trusted brethren in that council, now I'm quoting, "The way is open. It is clear to my mind what to do. All they want is Hyrum and myself. Then tell everybody to go about their business. Do not collect in groups, but scatter about. There is no danger. They will come here and search for us. Let them search. They will not harm you in person or property, not even a hair of your head. We will cross the river tonight and go away into the West." So now, 22nd of June, 1844, Joseph now feels impressed. He needs to leave Nauvoo, go across the river and head for the mountain west. So as he did that, then, he was counseling with others of the group, in particular to Stephen Markham. And here now, quoting from the history of the church, it was while debating the questions of submitting to the demands of the governor, the prophet expressed to Stephen Markham, a close associate of his, the desire for Hyrum Smith to leave him. I told Stephen Markham, he is recorded as saying, if Hyrum and I were ever taken again, we would be massacred, or I was not a prophet of God. I want Hyrum to live to avenge my blood, but he is determined not to leave me. So Joseph was willing to go on his own. Hyrum said, and again I wasn't there, but the record is Hyrum saying, Joseph, you're not going by yourself, I'm going to go with you. So they had crossed the river from Nauvoo on the Illinois side into the state of Iowa, getting ready to leave for the Great Basin. They'd asked for some horses. The horses from, in fact, Joseph's close friend, Orrin Porter Rockwell, then was asked to bring the horses. Porter Rockwell came back the next day. Rather than the horses, he had some letters. He had letters from Reynolds Cahoon and some others of the church membership in Nauvoo, and basically they accused him of being a coward, accused him, Joseph, and Hyrum of being cowards. How can you leave right now? Because all this is happening. In fact, Emma wrote a letter as well that came across. Thomas, a question.
Robert wants to know how long Joseph and Hyrum were in Carthage jail.
They were there from the 2 days. They were there before they were martyred. So right now they're not in Carthage jail yet. They're getting ready to leave and go to the west.
How long were they in Liberty jail then?
What's that?
How long were they in Liberty jail?
That was about 5 months.
Okay.
They were in Liberty from. So they're they're in Liberty jail from October, November through April. So about 6 months in Liberty jail during that winter when all the saints were migrating. And at that migration time, Brigham Young, as president of the Quorum, had the leadership of the church and coordinated all that and got the majority of the saints out safely. So Joseph is in Iowa with Hyrum, ready to leave. And he receives these letters, and many of those individuals complained of his conduct as cowardly, and treated him to return to Nauvoo, not leave them as a false shepherd. So they were concerned. Joseph made this comment, if my life is of no value to my friends, it is of none to myself. So he returns back to Nauvoo. Then there's some discussion between Joseph and Governor Ford and Governor Ford was adamant. Now, remember, as we said, Governor Ford had gone down to Carthage, had assembled a significant hundreds of militia there. And eventually Joseph and Hyrum agreed. They had asked, first of all, for a posse to come and escort them so they would not be assassinated on the way down. Governor Ford said, no, I'm not going to do that. Anyway, they're going back and forth. And eventually Joseph and Hyrum agreed to go down to Carthage unaccompanied. In that process of going down to Carthage on the 24th of June, he made the following, I'm going like a lamb to the slaughter. But I am calm as the summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense towards God and towards all men. I shall die innocent, and it shall yet be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood. So Joseph, certainly as a prophet, full well recognized that going to Carthage, that he would be murdered. He would not survive that. He went anyway. Now, did he understand the ultimate real reason? We'll talk in a moment why he went to Carthage, why it was necessary for him to go. I'm not certain. There's no indication other than the fact that he knew if he went down to Carthage, even though Governor Ford had promised with a solemn oath that if he and Hyrum would come down to Carthage, they would be protected and safe. And Governor Ford gave his word as a man and as governor that they would not be harmed while they were there awaiting trial in Carthage. However, as we know, later that 2 days later, after they had arrived at Carthage, and they went and were incarcerated there in Carthage jail, on the 27th of June, this mob of about 150 to 200 persons then attacked the jail There were wardens at the jail. They were kind of cordially allowed to leave. Their duty was to protect and not allow people to come in. They left, and these 150, 200 were, again, the infamous members of what was known as the Carthage Greys that came into the jail at that time. So, again, imagine 200 men rushing, crowding up the stairs as best they can. Again, I didn't want to go into details as to all that happened there, other than the fact that we know that there were 4 individuals in the cell at the time on the upper floor. Joseph Smith, his brother Hyrum, John Taylor, and Willard Richards, who were the two members of the Quorum of the 12 that were still there. The others off on missions. So these 150, 200 men are rushing up the stairs, crowding up the stairs. There's just a wooden door there. They're firing through the door. There's a lot of things going on. The one thing of importance to note is that the first individual that was shot and died was Hyrum. So Hyrum was shot first, and then he died just shortly before Joseph was assassinated as well. In section 135, then, we have these words from John Taylor. John Taylor was there, again a member of the Quorum of the 12, and he writes the following: to seal the testimony of this book and the Book of Mormon, we announce the martyrdom of Joseph Smith the prophet and Hyrum Smith the patriarch. They were shot in Carthage jail on the 27th of June, 1844, about 5 o'clock, by an armed mob, painted black, of from 150 to 200 persons. Again, Hyrum was shot first, fell, and exclaimed, "I am a dead man." Joseph then went to Hyrum, and then he attempted to leap from the window, and he was shot, fell out of the window by the well. And both Hyrum and Joseph then were repeatedly shot after they had already been assassinated. Then John Taylor goes on further to write about the prophet Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more, save Jesus only, for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that ever lived in it. He lived great, he died great in the eyes of God and his people, and like most of the Lord's anointed in ancient times, he has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood. And so has his brother Hyrum. In life they were not divided, and in death they were not separated. So John Taylor goes on further to write. He says, henceforth their names will be classed among the martyrs of religion, and the reader in every nation will be reminded that the Book of Mormon and this book of Doctrine and Covenants of the Church cost the best blood of the 19th century. Their innocent blood, with the innocent blood of all the martyrs on the altar that John saw, will cry unto the Lord of hosts till he avenges that blood on the earth. And so we see what has occurred here now is that these two individuals, Joseph the prophet and his brother Hyrum the patriarch, as John Taylor states, had sealed their testimony of the work with their blood. And we'll see now, as we go through Scripture and recognize this is often an act which is necessary in many cases, and talk about an evidence for the reality of the restoration, and evidence for the truthfulness of what Joseph brought forth. That final act of sealing the testimony with his blood. And we can see, don't have time to go into that this evening, but in our next session, when we talk about our final session on the Doctrine of Covenants, we'll talk about some of the events that occurred after the martyrdom and what the consequence was of the shedding of innocent blood. Not only the locals there in Illinois, but Thomas Ford, the governor of Illinois, and some complicit with the governor of Missouri, as well as far as the Lord was concerned, the government of the United States that sanctioned this act. And what occurred because of this unjust, unjustified, illegal action to assassinate Joseph and Hyrum. They absolutely were innocent, had never been proven of any crime. Absolutely innocent. What's happening now, we see Lucifer thinking, and in fact, he had put this thought into the minds of many of those who were in the area. This church, this organization, is the church of Joseph Smith. If we eliminate Joseph Smith, in fact, as Thomas Sharp stated in his article in the Warsaw Signal a week earlier, he said it's a time to exterminate, absolutely exterminate the leaders of this movement. They had thought if we do that, that'll put an end to it. All of the adherents will scatter, they'll be afraid, they've lost their leader, they've lost their so-called prophet, and the church will falter. Well, we know from the historical perspective and from the fact that I'm standing here today, that did not happen. Because this is not the church of Joseph Smith. It never was the church of Joseph Smith. Joseph never claimed it was his church. It is the church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It never was the church of a man. So all that maneuvering that Satan had in mind, everything he was attempting to do came to naught. And we will see now, as we talk about the divine law of witnesses, although it was a very traumatic, heart-rending situation, we now can understand, and we'll take a few minutes and talk about here, the divine law of witnesses and what that means. We will see, even though on many occasions I can tend to be emotional when I think or read or talk about the martyrdom, because I have a great love for the prophet Joseph Smith and for his brother Hyrum. Oftentimes I have heard many outside the church that will say, well, you quote-unquote Mormons, you worship Joseph Smith as if he were a god of sorts. And I say, no, we do not worship Joseph Smith. Joseph never claimed that or asked for that. He was only acting as the prophet of God. We honor him, and we respect him, and revere him as the prophet of the restoration. No more, no less. At the same time, we worship Jesus Christ, who is the head of this church. I want to go read here in the Divine Law of Witnesses from section 6. So this is a revelation given in the very early days of the restoration. This is in April of 1829 to Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery had now come down at that time in April and had offered his services as a witness or as a scribe for Joseph as the translation of the plates was going on, which then would become the Book of Mormon. So Oliver Cowdery, for a long time, for some 10 years, the early part of the church, was very devout and very faithful, and held, as I mentioned before, that position as the second elder of the church. Here now in this Revelation, section 6, verses 28 through 30. Now behold, I give unto you Oliver, and also unto my servant Joseph, the keys of this gift, which is a reference to the gift of translation, which shall bring to light this ministry. And in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. So this law of witnesses goes back to Old Testament times in the book of Deuteronomy under the law of Moses. It was indicated there under Judaic law, now still carried forward to the time of Christ. They needed at least 2 witnesses for any work that was going on. In verse 29, the Lord goes further. Verily I say unto you, if they reject my words, they meaning the people, that see this work, and this part of my gospel and ministry, blessed are ye, for they can do no more unto you than unto me. And I'm beginning to see maybe a little hint here about the future for Oliver Cowdery. Even if they do unto you, even as they have done unto me, blessed are ye, for you shall dwell with me in glory. So I think now here the Lord was trying to give a little indication early on to Oliver that maybe what was in his future. So we understand in order to seal the testimony of the restoration, it was necessary to have 2 individuals that would shed their blood. Joseph as the first elder, the first ordained apostle, Oliver Cowdery as the second elder. and the second apostle, which was his right in that position to be the second martyr. So let's see, what about Oliver Cowdery? Was he present as a witness in restoration of the priesthood keys? Absolutely. The Aaronic priesthood, 15th of May, 1829. Who was it? Joseph and Oliver. Oliver was there as the second witness, Joseph being the first. We recall when we talked about Joseph and the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon, when he came back after the witnesses had seen the plates and the angel, and he expressed to his mother, Lucy Mack Smith, what a relief it now was that burden had been lifted from him, because he no longer was alone by himself. Oliver Cowdery was one of those three witnesses. That did not relate to restoration of priesthood keys, which is, I want to follow this train of thought for just a moment. But Oliver Cowdery, one of the three witnesses. He was the second witness with Joseph at the time of the restoration of the Aaronic priesthood, as well as the second witness at the time of the restoration of the Melchizedek priesthood in the spring of 1829. In section 20 of the Doctrine of Covenants, we have the very specific and direct communication to the members of the new church that Oliver Cowdery was the second elder, an apostle, and the second elder, meaning that he was second only to Joseph in seniority, meaning that any time that Joseph was not present, or any time if Joseph were to be taken, Oliver would be in that position as the president of the church. He was with Joseph for the committal of the keys of the sealing power, the keys of the gathering of Israel, the keys of the gospel of Abraham, and the acceptance of the Savior. So, through all the restoration of priesthood keys, who was there? Oliver Cowdery. Oliver Cowdery then was in a position to stand with Joseph in Carthage. However, Oliver left. And as we said before, we now see in 1841, January of 1841, on the 19th of January, that all of these blessings that Oliver had were then transferred, bestowed, given to Hyrum. And so by right, Hyrum was second in line to Joseph. In fact, Brigham Young at one point was asked about, did Joseph ever appoint a successor? And Brigham said yes. Who was it? It was Hyrum. Brigham understood that concept of seniority. And Brigham said it was Hyrum, but Hyrum fell first in Carthage. Hyrum fell first at the time of the martyrdom. So Hyrum never was in that position, but nonetheless, he held the right. It was necessary to have two witnesses to seal the testimony of this work. Sean, if we go back to the camera. If I could then just, in closing, say that what I see as a result of the martyrdom, granted a major traumatic experience for the members of the church. Joseph was their prophet. Many had love and great affection for Joseph. They followed him. They recognized him as a prophet. Many people outside the church would say, well, Joseph was just this wonderful, charismatic young man. Well, certainly he was. He had significant great characteristics and attributes. However, my feeling is people recognized in this young man a true prophet of God. That is why they followed him, because the Spirit bore witness to them individually that this man was a prophet. He was not a charlatan. He didn't make this up. He indeed was a prophet of God. And as this past year, as we've talked about many of the beautiful teachings that he restored, the principle, the doctrine about the 3 degrees of glory, the doctrine about exaltation and in the celestial kingdom, the third heaven, as we talked last time. Beautiful principles that he brought back. We had, in fact, in our Sunday school today, there was talk about some missionaries that were in the South, I believe Kentucky or somewhere, Tennessee somewhere, and they had noticed a funeral for a young boy that had drowned, and the family had asked an itinerant preacher to come in and give them some comfort, to talk to them at the time of the funeral. Well, in fact, this itinerant preacher, rather than give the family comfort, chastised them greatly and said, why didn't you have this young man baptized? You had plenty of opportunity. You ignored that. So this young man now is going to hell. because he was never baptized. When we talked a couple of sessions ago, we read that doctrine in section 137 that Joseph restored, that everyone will have the opportunity. And just because we don't have this opportunity in mortality, we will have that opportunity. And furthermore, any young child, any young person under the age of accountability, which we understand is the age of 8 years of age, anyone who dies before that, who is not capable of sin because Satan is not allowed to tempt them, has a promise of inheriting the celestial kingdom. Beautiful doctrine. What comfort, what more comfort could there be for a family than grieving? In fact, that came to Joseph when he, in a vision of the celestial kingdom, as we mentioned a couple of weeks ago, saw his brother Alvin in vision. And the Lord revealed to him, all those who would receive the gospel, if they'd had an opportunity, will be allowed to inherit that. Beautiful doctrine that Joseph brought forth as a prophet of God. In closing, I will bear my testimony. I know for certain, without any question, without any doubt, as I've had an opportunity to study once again the life of the prophet Joseph Smith. And think about things like the translation of the Book of Mormon when Oliver Cowdery came back in April. We're talking April and May into June at 2.5 months, 520 some pages in our current English edition, without ever going back and correcting anything. There's no way that could happen unless it was done by the gift and the power of God. I know for reality that this work in which we are engaged is the work of God. And I bear testimony again this evening that Joseph Smith indeed was a prophet of God. He is the prophet of the restoration. And I leave that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ.